And the last seminar of the day, it's all about the industry itself, the role-playing game industry, and exactly where it's going, where it's coming from, so on and so forth. And it's going to be a very interesting panel of people who are meant to know what they're talking about.
Well, James Wallace is, quite revered. He's not the first time I met him. He obviously organises Game Camp, and he's big on the idea of exploring what a game means, and he's done that all the way through. So I think just having him chatting will be enough, but having the other people there as well, I think it's going to be quite interesting to hear what they consider the future of the UK role-playing games industry is, if there is one, because it's very American-centric.
Yeah, it is a very big if, and I wonder if they're going to be covering also the reasons why that if is there.
Well, it'd be nice to find out why it's become so American-centric, because the role-playing industry, like the computer games industry, was predominantly created in the UK in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and it's not here anymore. I mean, there are a few bastion kind of beachhead organisations still left here, but predominantly it's moved elsewhere, and you fit the market that you're selling to. So in a way, we're the kind of poor cousin now, and we have to take on board things that are primarily aimed at an American market. And it'd be nice to see if there's a way for us to have indie development that kind of reclaims that idea of role-playing from a unique UK perspective. I mean, if you think about the seminar we had earlier with Ian Livingston and Steve Jackson talking about fighting fantasy and how that didn't make the same inroads as things like Eternal Quest did and Choose Your Own Adventure, even though in my opinion it's a much better product. And there's almost a kind of resistance to British things. So I'd be interested to see if they will address the idea of how to make things UK again, to bring them back in, even if not in terms of manufacturing, because that's sadly gone even to China and other places.
Now, I'm going to predict something.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Kickstarter.
They will talk about Kickstarter.
If they mention Kickstarter, I will win my bet, because I've bet that every single speaker will talk about Kickstarter, and I've got a big load of money on this. I'll tell you, it's Kickstarter bingo. Do it at home. When anyone talks on a podcast about Kickstarter, tick a box, tweet to us, and you'll win a big prize. Because I don't think I've heard a podcast in the last 6 months that has not at least 28 million times mentioned Kickstarter.
Yeah, and since we are guilty of it, often, we promise to be a lot more.
We promise to do a Kickstarter free podcast soon.
Definitely. Anyway, let's listen to these guys have to say.
Absolutely.
Hello, good afternoon, thank you for coming. Can you all hear me if I shout a bit? Excellent. My name is James Wallace. This is the British role-playing industry, where it's come from and where it's going, and what we're going to attempt to do in the next hour or so is kind of a state of the art for the industry, a state of the industry for the art, talking about where we are as an industry right now, but also to understand where we are, we need to look at where we come from and why the British role-playing industry is the shape it is. And having looked at that, I think we should chat about where it's going to go, where it's likely to go, what it might turn into. So I have an august and overqualified panel with me, and I'll ask them to introduce themselves, starting on my extreme left, Mr. Phil Masters.
Hi, I'm Phil Masters. I suppose I qualify insofar as I was writing to write more when it was still in single figures production, issue numbers. I've been doing stuff on and off since, so I'm not sure how much it counts as British, other than the fact that I happen to be British, but and I'm still working on role-playing games and still living in Britain, so I suppose I count for that purpose.
I'm Dominic McDowell Thomas. I run Cubicle 7 Entertainment. We make role-playing games such as The One Ring, the Lord of the Rings game, Doctor Who Adventures in Time and Space, and we do some card games with the Doctor Who card game.
I'm James Wallace, as I said. I set up and ran Hogshead Publishing for 9 years in the 90s and 2000s. I've been writing for Whitehall, not as long as Phil, but in the 1980s and through to the 90s, and I now run the game consultancy Space! 3 A's, we're a AAA company.
I'm Simon Rogers, and I'm co-owner of Pro Fantasy Software, which was established about 18 years ago, makers of motion graphic software, and Belbrain Press, which has been around now for 12 years, and we publish The Dying Earth and the various Gumshoe system books, and more recently 13th Age.
I'm Piers Connolly. I set up the London Indie RPG meetup group where we play test and design independent role-playing games once a month, third Saturday of the month.
Fantastic. So, hard to know where to start really. I mean, the history of the British role-playing, I'm going to burble for a little. In the early days, the history of the British role-playing industry is the history of Games Workshop, since the British role-playing industry starts as Games Workshop imports 6 copies of Dungeons & Dragons direct from TSR in the States in, I believe, 1976, though I may be corrected on that. And Games Workshop and role-play went hand in hand for a long time, as I'm sure we all know and remember, most of us remember fondly, and there's still a lot of hostility towards Games Workshop for abandoning role-play as they did in the mid to late 1980s. And if you look back, they were not only the leading importer, they were the only games distributor who did this stuff in the UK. The only company of any significant size who were publishing RPGs. They were very vertically integrated, as they still are. They imported the stuff, in many cases they printed it themselves. Two of my original AD&D manuals are soft covers published under license by Games Workshop. They're not very collectible, sadly, though they are rare. And they were the force of role-play, and they saw role-playing through its glory days over here, and then realised, pretty much simultaneously with the departure of Ian Livingstone and Steve Jackson, that actually there was more money to be made out of miniatures. And less in games distribution, and they ceased to be a distributor, and we saw a rise of independent distribution. To understand the British market, you need to understand the way it works. There are publishers, then there are distributors. I'm not up to date on the current state of distribution, Simon can fill us in, but, or Dom, in fact. But back in the day, there was Games Workshop, then there was Deviant Games and Hobby Games, and Chart Hobby Distribution. Those were the big 3 in certainly the early 90s. Of those, Chart went in the mid-90s, I believe. Hobby Games went down 3 or 4 years ago, as Deviant goes from strength to strength. None of them has ever specialised in role-playing games. They've always been general games distributors. They supply the retailers, and the retailers supply you. And for a long time that was the model, and that was how games got to you. The other crucial thing to realise is that the British market is not a major market for role-playing games. And certainly today, but even in the 90s, it is not a big enough market to support a role-playing game publisher for someone who's trying to do it full-time. And this was the reason after Games Workshop stopped publishing and stopped distributing role-playing games, that you saw a number of British indies start up with big ambitions and big plans, and in some cases some really interesting games, and go bust within a year because they were focusing on the British market and there simply wasn't enough of the British market there. And if I can blow my own trumpet for a bit, this is what I realised. I started freelancing for American companies in the very early 90s. 1990, in fact, I started writing for Palladium Books. So I had a good understanding of how the American market went. I realised very quickly that it dwarfed our own, and realised that for a British company to succeed, it had to focus on the American market. And this is the big trumpet blow. I essentially created the business model, which was later picked up by Mongoose and People 7 and the others, which is stop, just pretend to be an American company. By all means, be based over here, but print and warehouse your books in the States. Treat the Americans, America and Canada as your primary market, and the rest of the world as your secondary market. Because if you don't do that, you will go bust. Hogshead lasted 9 years. I sold it. It didn't last long after that, for reasons that I'm not privy to. But that's basically how we got to the early 2000s, which was the years of the D20. Does anyone want to fill in something for what I've said? Phil, you were around for the 80s.
I was. I can remember, and I was there. No, there's not much I can add to that, to be honest. I was taking, frankly, a much more casual amateur approach than James did there. I was writing for White Dwarf through the 80s, starting in the 70s actually. Actually, my gaming goes back longer than that, because I was actually originally a historical war gamer back in the early 70s. But then by about 1990, I accidentally talked Hero Games into publishing a book of mine, which is still one of the longest books I've ever written. By no means the longest anymore. And I was writing, in the 80s, I was writing for British Magazine because it was a British magazine and it was cheaper to post after that. And
in fact, there were a bunch of British magazines in the 80s. I mean, in the 80s, there was the 80s were the glory years of role-playing. There was enough in the market to support not just publishers, but also three independent magazines. White Dwarf Adventurer, Games Master International. No, Games Master was the computer games one. There was GM and GMI.
we did actually...
Yeah.
Back in the days of Usenet, we did actually propose a list of how many British games magazines had been, and we tended to lose count very quickly.
It's true, many started up in the 2020.
To be honest, writing for White Dwarf, you had this definite sensation. Right, you sent White Dwarf an article and they accepted it, they would still be going by the time they published it. It was never certain of any of the other magazines, as far as I was concerned. I mean, some of them were nice and they were rather nice people, but they tended to come and go rather. Eventually did pretty well. Imagine did okay for a couple of years, as I recall.
30 issues, yeah.
You could say Valkyrie was the longest running in terms of time, though, in terms of its account, you know. It's...
in support of what James has said, recently I did a lot of number crunching for Pro Fantasy customers, and I imagine that they're a pretty equal selection across the various different role-playing games that are around. And sure enough, the number of role players in the States per 1,000 people is almost identical to the number of role players in the UK. It's just simply fewer people. And when Pro Fantasy first came out, the first thing we did was spend half our budget on a single advert in Dragon magazine, which of course was out in the States as well as in the UK, although we were allowed to pay UK rates. So we had the same idea, first of all pretending to be a large company, i.e. one that could afford a full-page advert in the Dragon magazine, and secondly pretending to be an American company. But it took us 10 years or so to get proper distribution into the States. Firstly, because no role-playing game shop would touch anything that was software. And secondly, because there was just no way of physically getting the products there apart from posting. And it was actually Ryan Dancy, who was eventually involved with Wizards of the Coast, who set up a mail order store in the States, which enabled us to sell our products. He was visionary enough to say, we'll take 100 of your products, come to Gen Con, we'll take 100 of your products and off you go. So when it came to setting up Pelgrave Press, the British market it really is a secondary thing. We print in the States, we ship to a location in the States, we have a bank account in the States, and secondarily we also have a mail order location over here. You have to be based in the States.
Yeah. I want to make it clear that we do love you, and we appreciate every single one of you. There just aren't enough of you. Go away and make more gamers. There are various ways of doing that, and I'm not suggesting you start right now. Which brings me briefly to just an incidental topic. I'm sorry there are no women on the panel, but the number of women in the history of the British role-playing industry is really pretty small. I'm not aware of any companies. No, there was, I think there was one, I forget the name of the company, they did a game called Tales of Gargantia, which was about 1994, I think, and they lasted, I think, a year, and I think their boss was a woman. But that's the only one I can think of. Karen Lewis, Karen McNeil, as is now. Yes.
I'd say she was the...
Yeah, I mean, there have been highly placed women within TSR UK, where TSR had a branch over here. White Dwarf, no. There are a number, if you look at the glory years of White Dwarf, there are a number of women writing for it. There's almost all female pseudonyms for Dave Morris, who was writing most of the magazine at the time. When Wizards of the UK, Wizards of the Coast took over Nightfall Games, there were a number of, again, highly placed women in terms of people actually running companies. I can't think of any, which is a crying shame. The opportunity is there, particularly with indie games. A question. If people want to throw questions at us.
Just a quick one. As games designers, you spoke about kind of like that we haven't got the facility in the UK for games. Can I ask what any of you personally have done to encourage younger gamers to join? I know, for example, that Phil offered on the forums to run a game for an 8-year-old this weekend, which I think is really admirable. But can I ask, like Piers and Simon especially, and maybe Don, what have you specifically done to try and encourage younger gamers to come through? Because it appears, you look around the room now, I can see a few youngsters, but the average age is probably over 35.
Yeah.
So what have any of you done to kind of encourage younger gamers and bring new blood into the market?
I think you're hitting on what is a problem in sort of in having children along to gaming groups. I think there are sort of unfortunately, the majority of people are decent, honourable, above the law. There's issues around child protection. So I'd love to set up a gaming group for people to bring their kids along to, and there are some great games that have been written for kids. Prince's Kingdom, which is a version of Dogs in the Vineyard. There's Mouse Guard, which is maybe a little bit complex, but actually children, it's based on Mouse Guard comics. The kids really sort of love those things. And I even know of a game of Sorcerer that's been run for children, sort of based on Pokemon monsters. So you sort of remove all the horrible aspects out of it, like the sort of that whole sort of what would you do and how far would you go to get it, sort of thing. But I think you're making a good point, Mick. What can people do to encourage people into this hobby?
There's two slightly separate questions there. One, what can people do to get people into the hobby, and B, what can you do to get very young kids into the hobby? There is nothing inherently logically wrong with recruiting people at 15, 18. Equally, recruiting them younger might be a good way of doing it. I think there's two slightly separate questions. I'm not going to take a huge amount of credit for offering to run that game. All I was said was that I was running this world game. There was nothing in it that was going to be personally suitable for 8-year-olds, and I was happy to have an 8-year-old along with his father to play. There is a problem. I've run a couple of conventions, and there's an inherent problem when you start looking at issues of child protection. If you start taking it too seriously, you probably have to have dozens of people with them trying to clearances and approval and all the rest of it. And sometimes from the point of view of somebody running a convention, it just begins to look too much like hard work. That's just inherent in child protection issue.
There are two separate issues. First of all, making a game that is suitable for children to play. Secondly, getting children to play. So I have 3 or 4 proposals for games designed for children. What I want to see is a book, a box set, designed for a reasonably clever 12-year-old to pick up without any assistance whatsoever from an adult and run a role-playing game for their friends. That's what I want. Well, first of all, I've got to get someone to write it. I would promote it through Kickstarter. If I had the right writer, the right ingredients, and the right playtesters, it would have a massive playtest. Everybody's 12-year-old and nothing. And then if it built up enough momentum, what you want is groups of 12-year-olds going off on their own game. Off you go, not interested in you lot. We're going to sit down and play our game how we want to, how we used to play our games. So that's what I want, but I haven't got the right, no one has pitched me the right combination of ingredients yet, but when they do, I'll publish.
But it's something that I talk about a lot with People 7 and various things. I think we've, with the Doctor Who license, got the opportunity there to have a popular license that we can extend to consumer younger demographic. And the card games are moving in that direction. I think part of it is, it's getting in front of people, and so they'll have the opportunity to pick it up. And I think then we start running into some distribution issues, and we're games companies, we're quite specialist. It's a bit more of a job then for us to break through into more of a mainstream market. Also in terms of resources as well, we can't, I can't bet the farm on doing a huge print run on a game that's going to get into Toys R Us and things like that. You need to move some baby steps in that direction. So I think there's, it's accepting the scale of the challenge really, because it's not just as simple as doing a child-friendly role-playing game, because no one's going to pick it up. I mean, for me, I think that the licenses give you a chance of doing that and get you've got an established audience there and something that the kids are going to get excited about that isn't anything to do with the game. And then once they play the game, get into it, and then having that sort of that product step by step, or stepping stones of products that you can get to bring people in. It's the I mean, I'm trying to think of equivalences from what brought us in, and it's the fighting fantasy. I mean, for me, for the first time,
I'd say that experience is different, because I think what we don't appreciate is we're socialised into role-playing games. That some guy probably sort of said to us, 20, 30 years ago, whatever your story is.
40 years.
Oh, we're 40 years ago. We're going to play this game. Do you fancy coming along? And you're sort of brought into it, and you're taught how to play, not through the rule book, but through a group process. And I think what really has disappointed me immeasurably about role-playing games is their rule books are appalling to a non-role player. I think it is a disgrace in the hobby, really. I would love to be able to give a book to somebody without telling them anything about role-playing games, and they can go off and do the basics sort of well.
It was, again, with Doctor Who, it was one thing I was absolutely dead set on, was that we had that 4-pager in there that is all a player needs to read to get everything to do with the rules.
I hold my hands up, so I'm not read it. Apologies.
It's something we say very looking at how we're presenting rules, and anyway, it's not just on the rules themselves and things like that, but it's looking at graphic design and communication disciplines as well, to really sort of how we almost like break it down into what we're trying to communicate with each page, and how we bring that across, and lots of different ways.
I think we could get completely bogged down. I mean, it is a really interesting topic, but we could get bogged down in it. I'll say another question point over that.
Well, I was going to say, aren't you guys missing a trick? Instead of targeting children, which, as you say, is very difficult, why don't targeting the parents?
Specifically the mothers. So what are we doing to widen this out to make it... The majority of people in the room are male.
Well, speaking as a parent, and not the only one on the panel, the moment you become a parent, your free time to play games pretty much disappears forever. Well, not forever, but for several years. It becomes a very, very low priority. If you could work out a way, if you could design a role-playing game for parents to play with their kids, and I think there may be an opening there, that's a potentially interesting niche. But one of the points I was going to make is, we talk as representatives of the British role-playing industry. It's tiny. None of us has... Typical 7 is the largest. I don't know how many employees you have. I'm guessing it's less than 10.
Yes.
Basically, all of us together probably make a large and successful sweet shop worth of there are big problems to solve.
I'll probably contribute about sort of 2 or 3 blackjacks or fruit salads to that whole thing. That's the high scale of operation.
There's the old joke of, how to make a small fortune in the role-playing industry, where you start with a large fortune. And I've watched many people do that.
It is a lovely sweet shop to work in.
It's the best sweet shop in the world. Yes. And strangely, you'll tend to end up fat as well. So it's a question there, someone have a hand partly raised? Yes.
I've got kind of an additional comment, but also a question, so it's a bit moved on. But I run games for younger children, and I find that you can, I've been doing that outreach things with universities and stuff, and it's really quite easy to get into primary schools and run games if you convince them that it's teaching basic literacy and mathematics. So crunchier games are actually surprisingly good to move into the classroom. They're like, so actually we're going to pretend to be fantasy heroes for like an hour or so, but also you're learning how to plus and minus. What I was really interested in is how do you think that England compares to that other weird RPG Galactica in Japan, which kind of got TSR and then nothing else for about 20 years. And again, developed so homegrown bizarre style of literature.
There's some wild stuff comes out of Japan. Really. Have you played Maid? Maid is, if you've not played Maid, have a go at Maid. I mean, it's quite crunchy. You roll lots of dice. You roll up your characters this way. and it is bizarre, and it's sort of wonderfully bizarre.
Details, please.
Like what costume you're wearing, and actually the GM is the person you serve. So the GM, I was a maid, and the GM was a 5-year-old boy called Little Billy, and it was very. We had to sort of ingratiate ourselves to this sort of child while sort of bitching and backstabbing to be the little boy's favourite. It was all while wearing sort of very bizarre costumes. So that's my for you. Oh, and actually, Little Billy was a diplomat who was sort of convening a meeting on his flying palace. So we had to sort of cater for this party of aliens coming. So a lot of this was sort of set in motion by the rules, and we then ran with that. So, yeah. I will. I was a gothic Lolita.
I'm actually quite glad to say that I know nothing about the Japanese film. I'm terrified now.
There are. Well, yeah, it is. It is left field, and you know, if you're wanting to cater to mainstream role-playing games, mainstream role-playing game tastes, don't go there. You know, that's where I'm coming from. I wouldn't say I'm anywhere part of the mainstream. You know, I'm very left field. If you're looking for a business model, there's 4 people here who are very eminently capable of discussing that. I'm an enthusiast.
But the other thing is that to a certain extent it's more of a hobby than it's a business for everybody. In that even if we all stop publishing games, people would still be playing role-playing games. It's never been easier for people to get their games to people, run them and play them. Yeah. So if we all stop publishing and went our own ways, it wouldn't be the death of the industry, it wouldn't mean that people would stop playing. It might mean that Dragonmeet wouldn't have an operator, who knows. So we don't flatter ourselves that we're
Well, no, I Kickstarter on them.
Yes, the only thing I would say is that it's easy. It's very easy to get games out to people, but they are going to be people who are really looking for games. This is the whole PDF of the internet-based, all the rest of it, distribution model is very nice, but actually getting that to people outside the existing hobby is a difficult bit, I think.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, it's a point about the shape of the industry generally right now. The barriers to entry have never been lower. It's never been easier, not only to get a game, to publish a game or a game supplement, but to get other people to throw money at you before you do with Kickstarter. There you go, Mike Reddy's been playing Seminar Bingo. Completed his card with the mention of the 8th mention of Kickstarter. Kickstarter has fundamentally changed the shape of the industry, and now Kickstarter, if you didn't know, has a UK branch. You can start up a project in pounds and will receive your money in pounds, whereas up till the beginning of November, you had to have access to an American bank account to get any money out of Kickstarter. You had to pretend to be American. Where have I heard that before? So a lot of people are doing, if you were in for the previous seminar, the amount of money that Robin Laws and Hellgrain have made from their Hillfolk Kickstarter. They asked for $3,000, they made $94,000. And you know, there's an element of, well, what the hell are you going to do with that money? And I'm very glad that they're giving some of it to me. I'm writing a thing for it. But if you have a project that you think could catch fire, Kickstarter's an amazing way of getting free publicity for it and just testing the water and seeing if there is a market for it. Because if you ask for £5,000 and you get 1.5, there's either you're shit at Kickstarter, which is a possibility. There's a project out there, a friend of mine who has used Kickstarter a couple of times, got this apparently long ranty email from a guy going, "You're doing it all wrong, your games are all wrong, you should be doing things for the iPad and all the rest of it, and watch me," and launched his Kickstarter asking, I think, for £12,000, and after 5 days has raised £74. There is an art to it. But if you don't raise the money, and if you're doing things right, and there's easy how-to guides for Kickstarter out there, if you don't raise the money, there's probably not a market for what you're promoting.
That's the thing to say about Kickstarter. As far as I can see it outside, I've not used it, I've not been much involved with various reasons. it looks on the surface like a way of raising money for projects. Actually, it isn't. It's a way of publicising projects and checking that there is a market for them. By and large, the odds are you could get the project put together somehow, but if it was the sort of thing that didn't raise any money on Kickstarter, then when it sell, you'd lose that money. Whereas this way you find out whether or not there is a market.
There's a question up front.
It's coming from an owner of Patreon, manager of the Central America, and he's very reluctant to start any products that have been financed through Kickstarter, sees it as a pre-order system, and that people who couldn't afford to work through him may well have worked for the book, therefore you can start with 5 to 10 products that you can't sell. So
I could address that. If we look at Hillfolk, what we were going to be selling was a 96-page perfect bound monochrome book, which we would have sold 300 copies, 400 copies straight off, and another 600 through distribution to retailers. Now we have 2 perfect bound 240-page books in sort colour, which we've pre-sold 1,200, 2,000, and they'll sell another 1,000 or 2,000 copies through retail. So the retailers will be selling more copies of a better book and making more money as a result of the Kickstarter. Where I do feel sympathy with retailers on this is retailer Kickstarter's reward level. And retailers do not want to invest in stock that does nothing. So if they put their money into a Kickstarter, that's not going to be stock. That's going to be money doing nothing. So we are looking at ways in the future when we do Kickstarters via our US distributor, and hopefully other Kickstarters will join in, so that a retailer can pledge to a Kickstarter without giving any money until the product is out. So they get the benefit of the cheaper pre-order and getting on there without the downside. Now I did speak to another publisher about this, and the issue is it's the medium level Kickstarter projects that appear to have a shorter tail through retail. If you've done something amazing, then you're going to sell loads more through retail. So in the case of Hillfolk, the retailers are going to do really well. But if the retailer's right, then you've saturated your market during the Kickstarter, then maybe they've got a point. It's certainly a game changer, but retailers have to a blanket decision to not buy anything from Kickstarter that's being on Kickstarter is just not right.
Not least, I think, because increasing numbers of not only existing and new designers, but publishers are going to use it as a way of financing projects.
Durance, Jason Morningstar's new game was on Kickstarter. I think it was, if you're retailing role-playing games and you're not stopping that, you're nuts.
The Pathfinder MMO is, Pathfinder are using Kickstarter as a way of financing their projects. If there's a viable product in the market right now, Pathfinder, I've heard from a number of retailers, including one today, Pathfinder outsells D&D these days for an awful lot of shops. If they're turning to Kickstarter, it's not because they're desperate for the money, it's because they can see the benefits of doing it. We talked, Simon touched briefly on numbers there. I thought, in the historical context, it might be interesting to talk about where sales figures used to be and where they are now. Phil, do you remember what your first book was? Kingdom of Champions?
Kingdom of Champions.
Do you remember how many they printed?
No, I'm not sure they even told me. I think we mentioned at some stage, but I wasn't on royalties on that one, so I didn't get told numbers. I think it was probably of the order of 3,000 or 5,000, but don't quote me on that.
And what year was that?
That would have been 91, I think.
91. That's because my first book was Mutants in Avalon. You may spot a theme here for British writers doing books about Britain. Mutants in Avalon was not my title, or indeed my concept. It was an After the Bomb supplement for Palladium, it's interesting because it's what we call tertiary product. It was After the Bomb was a supplement for the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles role-playing game, and then Mutants in Avalon was a supplement for After the Bomb. So it's a third level thing. The conventional wisdom in the role-playing industry is that tertiary product is death. You don't, because you're reliant on people having bought not only the core book, but then the supplement and being invested enough in the supplement to then buy the supplement to the supplement. Palladium published in their initial print run on Mutants and Avalon was 10,000 copies. It didn't go to reprint because this was about the time that the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles craze was dying off and the RPG went the same way. The second book I did for them, which was a Rifts crossover with Mutants in Orbit, was the title. That I think printed 8,000. When I started Hogshead, our initial print run on Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, which was our big license, this is 1995, we printed 5,000 copies and we sold them in a year. Admittedly, that's a book with the word Warhammer on the cover in big letters, which is the exception to pretty much every rule. But when we did Slay Industries, which was a reprint, around 2000, we printed 3,000 of those and shifted them, I think, in a year to a year and a half, and then did a reprint of 2,000 copies, which the printer screwed up and put into hardback. Well, because we ticked one, long story. But we sold those as well. Nobilis, which was the first non-boxed RPG to break the $40 barrier. Man, a role-playing game that costs more than $40, how can this be? Which was a gorgeous, it was a coffee table book, but I did it deliberately to annoy retailers. Sorry. But that, we blew through 3,000 copies of that in 6 months. The reason I closed Hogshead, Hogshead didn't go bust. I essentially acid stripped the company and then sold the remnants of it onto someone else. And the reason for that is my base rule had been if we didn't ship 2,000 copies of a Warhammer supplement on day one, then we were in trouble on it. Because we weren't going to cover our costs straight out the gate. And that happened for 2 supplements in a row, and I saw the writing on the wall. And the industry had contracted so far that I didn't think it was possible for me to continue doing the sort of games that I found interesting, which was kind of stuff that pushed the boundaries, because Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay has never put the boundary in its life, but Nobilis was a groundbreaker in the new style games we were doing, which were the forerunners of today's story games and indie games. They were reprinted, I think, 3,000 of the original Barrel and Chowser, and it took us 18 months to ship those. But Hogshead did, by the time I closed it, we'd sold 8,000 copies of Barrel and Chowser, which admittedly was award nominated. It was a breakout hit. Largely thanks to Ken Hite, who I don't think is in the room, but who became the St. Paul of the nascent story game scene, and basically went out and converted everybody and just told people, you must buy this. And it's thanks to him, I would say, that we have a story game scene today. But I don't know numbers after about 2002 until we came to do Dragon Warriors in 2008, which I've been told that the industry had stabilised and the sales figures were recovering. No, we did 2,000 Mongoose. I published through Mongoose, through their independent creators imprint, Flaming Cobra. We did 2,000 copies of the rulebook, and I think it took 3 years to sell them. The supplements by the end were printing less than 1,000 copies of each one. It is hard to make money on an illustrated book with an original full colour cover if you're printing less than 1,000 copies of it. And I was regarding this, I was trying to make this part of my income stream, part of my executive pay. I lost a deal of money on Dragon Warriors. I hope people who bought it enjoyed it, but commercially speaking, it was a mistake. Don, are you prepared to share sales figures?
I'll share some sales figures, yeah.
Okay.
For me, on the bulk of our lines, my kind of measuring stick at the moment is how long it takes to sell 2,000 units. So for most of my core books, I'll do a 2,000 run on, and this is for things like Primeval Laundry, Grass, and all that sort of stuff, Star Blaze, Victoria. So on that basis, at the moment it's taking between 9 and 18 months to get through 2,000. So the Laundry, actually much a bit quicker. The Laundry went through 2,000 in 8 or 9 months, something like that, so it was just a reprint. Star Blazer went through 2,000 in about 14 months, I think. yeah, Victoria, and I think maybe a bit longer than 18 months. It was slower, but yeah, that's kind of where we are for core. But then obviously Wandering Doctor Who are different. The licenses are that much bigger audience. It's thanks to Bits and Mortar, where you get the PDF free if you buy the hard copy. That kind of messes up the numbers. I think that a lot of people do go for the Bits and Mortar option. Yes, it varies quite a lot, and I'm rubbish at looking at stats for that, but I think that off the top of my head, I've got the probably 300 plus or minus in a similar kind of, so much less. But as I say, because we bundle it up, I think a lot of people, we convert people into the against the nice book as well.
I think with Trailers of Cthulhu, about a third of sales are PDF only, and that's a reasonable balance. Interestingly, on the Pro Fantasy side, we've now reached the stage finally where slightly over half of people are just downloading and not asking for a media in the manual, because software is obviously very different. But I'm not seeing a great trend towards people abandoning hard copy books. And as far as our sales are concerned, generally they're slightly more modest than DOMs. But Trail of Cthulhu's probably sold 10,000 copies altogether in various forms. What that means for us is that James was talking about the tertiary sales. Our secondary sales are now sufficient that we can print a decent print run of a book. So an adventure will typically sell somewhere between 20 and 50% of the total sales of your core book. So, for example, Book Hounds is on the second print run and will probably, by the end of next year, have sold 3,000 copies. So that's but with a standalone game, I don't really mind how many copies I sell. A lot of the stuff I publish is never going to make a decent amount of money. I'm just doing it because I enjoy it. And 30 pages, we think, will be in a different category.
I think it's sort of different down at the indie end of the market, which is if you've got a sort of smaller rule book, then you can print off anywhere between sort of 16 and 64 pages, sort of relatively easily at work when no one's around, and stuff. I never do that, by the way. But I think that's a feasible way, and I think I'm a bit of a print fetishist, so I do like a hard copy. But actually, when I've run games, it's a lot sort of easier to actually have a PDF, because you can print out the sheets, give them away. They get written on. But then I think you're looking at very sort of, it's not a business model, it is sort of a hobby model, an enthusiast model.
What a typical print run for an indie game is these days? There is a typical indie game.
Ash, what is the typical print run for an indie game?
90 to 100.
Yeah.
Well, the great thing now is that apart from hardbacks with colour in them, or any books with colour in them, I can print 10 books, 10 really nice, perfect bound books, at not that much more per unit than it would cost with offset. So if there's a book that I've gone for a print run, I might give my own print 300-400 of it, and then every so often I'll print another 50 or another 20 or just another 10. And anybody can do that. The technology that we haven't yet got is printing hardback, full colour books, but give it another 5 years.
That's something to look forward to, I have to say. Yeah, with regards to the PDF numbers versus the hard copy numbers, certainly the numbers I've seen for some of the girls the hard copy sales have been in the thousands and still not been considered very good, whereas the PDF copies have been in hundreds. It's still, people are still buying books over PDFs.
But the other reason for valuing, as a publisher, for valuing PDF sales over hard copy sales is that if you're charging $20 for let's say round figures, easier figures, £10 for a PDF, of that, you as the publisher, if you go through drive-through RPG, you'll be making £8 back. their margin. It is £7. I think 7.5 if you're exclusive, which is a pretty good margin. If you're publishing a hardback book or a book at £10, you will receive from the distributor who does that £4. You will sell it to them for £4 and you will have to pay the shipping to them. You will also have to pay the printing. So for the books, I think we used to estimate that we would get, on any given book sale, we would receive 1/10 of the cover price as revenue. So you can see a PDF sale to a publisher is worth almost 3 times what a copy sale is. A copy, it's a lot less hassle because the systems are completely automated, drive-through RPG. The way I sell my books there is every month a PayPal payment arrives. That's basically it. I don't have to reship everything. I don't have to phone up the distributor and go, are you running low on copies of this? Would you like another 12, 24? Oh, you'd like 6? Okay, we'll ship you 6.
It's a point to note actually that the royalties I'm getting from GURP stuff in PDF are, shall we say, about 5 or 10 times the percentage rate I'm getting royalties on hard copy stuff. So that's the same thing coming through to me as the author. The only thing I'd say with that's great for me in the sense that it means if I sell a few hundred, I'm making the same sort of money per word as if I sell as if a book sells a few thousand in hard copy. The snag is that only a few hundred people getting it, not a few thousand, which means that it's a much smaller market. It's a shrinking market, and that's what I'm worried about.
That was my point about copy sales. I just remembered another one. Does anyone remember Ray Rangers Underground? It was a Mayfair Games release, and I think 1991. It was a full colour soft cover. It was a hard superhero. It was a dark superhero game, and it was full colour, admittedly. I remember, because I knew Ray at the time, they printed 70,000 copies of that and sold that out, and that was not considered an exceptional print run for a top rank game. These days, Dom's printing 2,000 copies of a game of similar stature. That is how much the market has shrunk in 20 years. I think it has stabilised, but I still don't think there's a lot of money there.
I was just going to say, but actually what you were also seeing, sort of, certainly from the indie end of things, is I think there's actually more games being produced, and it's not sort of, people aren't necessarily producing systems. There are still sort of systems like Apocalypse World coming out, but in a sense, the game is now what a scenario was, say, 20 years ago. That you have a product and you can sort of play it a few times and then you just move on to the next thing. So in a sense, I sort of see that as a model that you're designing and producing sort of scenarios effectively that are good entertainment for a few sessions.
Yeah, if you want to look at people who are pushing the formats at the moment and looking for new ways to play games and potentially to return to the subject of games for kids and stuff like that, look at the indie market. There's some really, really interesting stuff there. I'm doing an indie project of my own come January. It's called Las Vegas. It's I thought I'd come up with a new model for it. Discovered the French are already publishing these things and calling them bursts. It's a rule set and a 4-session adventure, and that's the entire game. When you finish those 4 adventures, you're done with the game. The model is an HBO miniseries rather than a soap opera. Plug. Becky had a question, then you did, and I see one over there, and I believe we've got about 10 minutes to go.
What do you think the role of retailers or standard hobby game store is in the current market for us?
We love you. We love you. Value your retailers.
You are, as far as I'm concerned, you could be selling other stuff. Stocking other stuff that turned over more quickly. Therefore, if you're still in the market, you are doing something extraordinary for publishers, in that you are probably recruiting new gamers. And so what we've done for you is, starting with Bits and Mortar, that's been the main development for the past 3 or 4 years. We used to do something where if anyone emailed us and said, look, you give the PDF away with your mail order sale, what about importance of complete out, how about that? So Bits and Mortar for proactive retailers is a way of absolutely levelling the playing field. And not only that, retailers I've noticed tend to slightly discount their products over our retail prices. So they also have a competitive advantage over our direct sales in the sense that we always sell at full price. as far as I'm concerned, it was a point Phil was making. The reason that we love selling through retail is because they're people playing our games. If I produce Trail of the Theatre and I was printing 3,000 copies, I might sell 700 copies of those direct. Brilliant, I'm making far more money on those. But it's the other 2,300 people who I imagine playing the game that is the reason that I'm in the business, not maximising my revenue on every copy. And also, I can't print 700 offset colour books. I can only print 3,000 of them. So I have to sell them through retail. So that's why we value our retailers. And I've tried very many things to proactively help retailers to sell books, including doing packages of special editions with limited edition stuff. There's 3 RPGs and all this stuff. To be fair, slightly limited effect because the retailers are busy. So that's my position.
But as well, I said that our route to retailers is through distribution.
Yeah.
And you hear horror stories, don't you, of publishers sending loads of promo stuff out for printers, which the distributors then use as packing material. How true that is, I don't know. So, I mean, I think it's something that I'm definitely keen on talking about what we can do to do more of. But with Cubicle 7 as well, just on a commercial basis, 75% of our turnover comes from distribution into retail stores. So it's
in Britain, Stadium games are just brilliant. They're possibly the best distributor that there is anywhere in the world. So they do a really great job. I can rely on them to order more of our books than almost anybody else. In fact, than anybody else.
Yes, as Devium, I will second that. By the end of Hogshead, we were not dealing. We essentially had an exclusive with Devium. There was nothing written down. I just didn't want to deal with any of the other British distributors. I just wanted to deal with Devium. And our revenue in the UK went up. They are fantastic. They get games. They love games. They live and breathe and eat and sleep games. And
they're supportive.
They're supportive. They really are. And I'm seeing the one retailer who was nodding vigorously. You, sir, had your hand up at some point.
It wasn't a question, I was just going to comment on you talking about sales figures. I was just going to tell you the dark area sales figures.
Oh, right.
The comparison. You said, obviously, there's everything else, and then there's Warhammer,
yeah.
Which you have to take into account, but the first sales in the dark area is 30,000.
Yeah. That's Fantasy Flight?
No, that's Black Industries.
Oh, Black Industries, yes. Yeah. Yeah. I mean,
I'm talking about originally when we launched the book.
Oh, you mean the point where they...
The initial order, the initial print and orders of
and killed the company the day they launched the product.
It's... We should at some point have a seminar on Games Workshop and their interesting business decisions. I know some of the history of that. I've been a Games Workshop shareholder since they floated, and also know a bunch of the staff, so I get very interesting perspectives. But as I say, a seminar for another time. You have a question? I saw you first, and then over there.
What's the industry's biggest threat?
Threat? Eagles. A really good MMO, I think.
I think everyone's going to go to an MMO who's gone.
We've been threatened out of existence. There's no more threats, really. I think the industry is very stable. Everyone says it's dying every single year. I don't think it is at all. It's sitting around a table with people playing games. There are lots of other things you can do, but there's just nothing like that. So I don't see a threat, really.
I don't know whether it's a threat, but I'd say board games. And we're sort of told that now we're in the golden age of board games, and I agree with that. I love board games. That's one of my other hobbies.
I see board games.
But no, I see. Oh right, how dare you? How dare you? hey, you're being an Indian. I'm being Trump. No, I mean, I don't see it as a threat, but actually, if you want to spend your leisure time playing a role-playing game or a board game, I think there's that tension that exists.
I think to a large extent it's a false tension. I think if you're sitting around a table with your mates, you're doing what we all do, and you usually embrace each other as brothers and sisters.
We swear at each other.
Over there.
Just
just a sort of a reference to the PDF side. I recently read over Praxis Kickstarter and bought the PDF copies from them. What they've said is they have laid out PDF separately from the main book in landscape format for tablets and sort of redone it. I don't know if you have any thoughts on whether you think that's worth the bother.
I'm not a huge tablet. I mean, I don't own a tablet. I've seen people using rule books, and what I've heard people say is tablets aren't that great for jumping around unless you're sort of bookmarking various pages. So if you're doing things on the fly, maybe it's a sort of system you're unfamiliar with. I think you could be a little bit of a disadvantage. I could be a bit of a disadvantage. I don't know what other people feel. Also, I'm a bit particular about the displays. They're a bit glaring.
I think unless you happen to have somebody on the team who is very able at doing that sort of thing and doesn't mind putting a lot of time into it, and that's great. But my position's always been that I'm never ever going to try to be at the cutting edge of technology. I don't have the R&D budget. I want to be on the second wave as it gets easy.
I'm just going to say, I think something lots of publishers should do rather than doing PDFs is do EPUBs or Kindle format, because it's so much more readable. You can put hyperlinks into them. They're much more. There's a wider market there. We have 1 minute, so last question from there.
It was essentially a question about in my rules there are two layout formats, one for printed full colour tablet, and the other for the paperback book e-reader.
I think tablets seem to be getting smaller at the moment. I think that for the moment there's an awful lot of 7 inches coming out. You can buy a perfectly serviceable Android tablet for $50 these days.
We've got an Android app version of Nice Black Agents that's available for free download from bits and bobs from direct sales. And we're waiting for feedback from people from that. That was written by someone who really knows what they're doing. And we're also doing proper ebook versions for all platform books. But what we won't do is do a special layout to fit one of the many arbitrarily sized tablets that are available until we're selling. If we were selling 10,000 copies of every single book, then we definitely do it.
But it also feels. I mean, don't know anything much about computers, but it would be helpful if there was some form of, you have a standardisation of paper size in the UK. It'd be sort of helpful if there was a standardisation of, tablet and screen, not necessarily size, but the actual format. Exactly.
I think we're out of time. I have something I want to say right now, but I'm not going to. Many thanks for coming and listening. I hope it's been informative. I think what you've probably gathered is no one really knows where the industry is going from here. But there will be an industry, and it will continue to do interesting and exciting things, whether that's massive commercial releases or tiny little indie projects with a print run less than 100 copies. Keep going out there. Whether you buy from retail or buy direct from the publishers, please keep buying books, because that's how we keep going.
Say something very briefly. Go off and start designing games yourselves and put them out in a small format, because you play these games, you love these games. Find the aspects that you really love and do something very small with it on 10 pages. Do it, because you learn something. Even if you do something terrible, you'll learn something.
Sorry, anyone else? Very quick final words?
Thank you.
Evidently not. Thanks for listening.
And that was the panel talking about the industry, where it's been, where it's going. I cannot say that it is what I was expecting.
I'm not entirely sure what I was expecting either, to be honest, from this. But what was interesting is that they were looking at the heyday of role-playing games, which is not now for the UK, the American-centric, and they kind of spent a lot of time justifying why it was American-centric, the RPG industry. And then they attempted to try, and make a reference back to what sales were like and what sales are like now, and the realistic way of, to kind of point towards the future of publishing, and it seems to be little and often. Lots of small things, not huge 10,000 print runs. And I think there was a few little things that came out there. Pearl of wisdom from James Wallace was Kickstarter is to see how big your market is, not to make your product. And I think that was quite interesting. But there was a few interesting things. Again, from the previous session, there was the discussion about how Kickstarter had affected and improved the product, even for final retail sale, by being a kind of kick continuer, really.
Yes.
So again, useful, but possibly not as much forward thinking as I was expecting.
And I think, and I'm going to get into an awful lot of hate for saying this, but I think that is exactly what the industry is lacking. There is not an awful lot of forward thinking. The industry is still not good at all at marketing and promotion. When they ask, the guy in the public asked, what are you doing to promote? I'm sorry to say, but there was an awful lot of,
yeah, there was a lot of hand wringing, and people should, and maybe we could do, rather than concrete, I am doing this. And that contrasts with Ian Livingston, where he's doing lots of things in a whole different areas to try and increase people's interest in games and in gaming and technology.
I'm going to use a very dirty analogy of a saying that we have in Spanish. There's a saying in Spain that says, shit, the more you stir it, the more it smells.
Okay.
And I'm sorry to say that from the point of view of RPGs, we really need to stir the shit, and we need to make it smell. We need to make an awful lot of noise. And if companies don't begin to get clever about it, I don't think it's fair to expect, and although I think we should, that the community will also make some noise about it, because the community needs companies a great deal less than companies need the community. So I don't feel they are leading by example very well right now, and they need to sharpen up. That's my feeling.
Okay, I mean, just to finish off, if you don't look at new markets and accessible format, you're going to gradually shrink who you're selling to. I mean, for me, RPGs were a huge part of me growing up and becoming a young adult. I think they probably kept me out of the asylum. Unless you're playing Cthulhu, in which case they put you in the asylum. But, I mean, role-playing games don't have the same impact now that they used to do, and I don't think it's. I think what was interesting is they talked about contraction of the market from 10,000 down to a few hundred print runs, but they didn't really adequately explain why that is. And it wasn't just that the RPGs have gone down; it's that their relevance has gone.
Yes.
And until you put the relevance back in and build a sense of community again, and an open community, I mean, look at the Goliath stuff. Yeah. It wasn't very open. Unless you can open up that community, then it will shrink. I mean, I remember when text adventures were big, with a big thing. And text adventures now, they're a niche market, they're an area where you can be artistic, but it's not going to ever be the big mass market. And that's the area that RPGs are going towards,
Yeah, unfortunately, it is very much like that. So I really hope that they decide to take a look at how video games are doing things, how video games have expanded in the past, and see what they can do from the same lines to actually evolve again.
Or in the end, we'll end up with RPGs being like Fiasco.
Yeah.
Which are more free-form things rather than structured things with lots of scenario packs and rules and everything else.
Probably indeed.